died, because when you boys die, wisdom is going to die with you. He was being utterly sarcastic in the way he responded to them. So, here are a few pointers I want to make. Coming from the East and living in the West and being a latecomer to Christ, I am fascinated by how the same data is put into a different mix in different cultures. I have never ever talked to a Hindu who raises the problem of evil and questions, therefore, some kind of a transcendent power as existent or non-existent in this world. And if you talk to a Muslim, the problem is never raised and phrased in a moral way the Western worldview addresses it. If you were to talk to a Hindu, the answer is pretty straightforward. Karma. Karma. Every birth is a rebirth. Every life is just paying its dues for the previous birth. And no matter what your stripe of Hinduism, whatever background of Hinduism you represent, whether you're a monist or a dualist or whatever, the question of suffering for both of them is answered in one common belief on both sides of it, whether you take the Veda or whether you take the Gita and its writings. It is the fact that every birth is a rebirth. All Hindus believe that. If you were to talk to a Hindu, the two non-negotiables are karma and reincarnation. There are different ways in which they come to, whether it's a devotional life or whether it's a life of knowledge, whatever, but rebirth, karma, reincarnation, that is believed by all Hindus, at least considered as a litmus test. What I found fascinating was researching the subject addressed by the Islamic world. There's a real paucity of material by Muslim scholars addressing this issue. Yeah, you find it here and there, either at an extremely popular level or at a level which almost seems very close to being fatalistic, but never ever questioning Allah in the process. So typical Muslim's response will be, Inshallah, it's the will of God, it's the will of God, it's the will of God. So for the Muslim, it's reincarnation karma. For the Hindu, for the average Muslim, it is Inshallah. Only the Christian really raises this before the face of God. A Christian really raises this with a moral sense. And so you go back to the book of Job or you even go to David. You know, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? You go to the book of Habakkuk. All you're making me look at is injustice, evil, and suffering. How can you explain all of this to me? And of course, the book of Job, he raises this, I've been a good man, I've not even looked upon anybody with lust as far as I know, and if I have, reveal to me what I have done. That's what he's crying out to God for. And God takes him through a process which is quite fascinating. Comes to him as creator, designer, revealer, comforter, mediator, savior, and strengthener, restorer. But the hook on which all of this hangs for Job is God is the creator, designer. And then he takes him through revealer, comforter, mediator, savior, strengthener, and restorer. Now that hook is removed of the creator, designer. Then I ask you, not just what happens to the answer, but what happens to the question. If God is removed as creator, designer, what happens to the question? Is the question still valid rationally and morally? Because the judgment against God is, how can you allow so much to take place and still expect us to believe in you? The implication being, this is an unjust world, this is an immoral way of doing things, we cannot accept it. So here's the way I approach it, and I'm not sure it is uncontested, but here's the way I look at it. When one says that such a thing is evil, they have to assume that such a thing is good. When they assume that such a thing is good, they assume that such a thing is a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. And when they assume a moral law, they must posit a moral law giver, but that's whom they are trying to disprove and not prove. Why must they posit a moral law giver to justify the question? Here's my response to that. Any problem on evil and suffering is either raised by a person or about a person. Which means the question assumes the intrinsic value of personhood. Can naturalism afford that thought? That people have intrinsic worth, and so when you see a violation of this individual, we consider it evil. So the only way I think the question still remains solid is if people have intrinsic value and intrinsic worth. And I believe only in the Judeo-Christian worldview does it give us that intrinsic worth and intrinsic value. I want to present the dilemma this way. The dilemma, I think, is larger than the problem of evil. So let me give you 3 components and leave these thoughts with you, and then let Vince pick it up. First is this. James Stewart of Scotland makes the comment that God conquers not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, but he conquers through it. He conquers not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquers through it. I have given that thought an awful lot of engagement in my own mind. I do see it happening. Just last week, one of our close friends, his wife passed away at the age of 62. Diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, passes away 2 years later. She was a lovely person. Many in the room met the husband last week when we were together in Florida. And her brothers-in-law were having lunch or dinner with us in Bangkok, Thailand. My colleague Thomas and I were there having lunch with them. And one of them said this, Bobby Waldemuth, dying now because this was about a couple months ago and she had not yet passed away, looked at her entire family and made this comment. I want you to know that as painful as these 2 years have been, I would not exchange those 2 years for anything. I would not change it for anything. How does one get there? How does one come to that unless you submit to the fact that God conquers not in spite of it, but God conquers through it? That was the same assertion by Malcolm Muggeridge when he said, whatever I have learned in these years of my life, I have learned much more from suffering and pain than I have ever learned from mere pleasure, however fleeting it may have been. So the first question is this, is it possible that God conquers through it and not in spite of it? Number 2, Chesterton's comment is valid, that meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Some of the loneliest people in the world I have met are those who have exhausted pleasure and ended up empty at the other end. It was actually 3-4 years ago, one of the neighbors of Robin Williams wrote to me and asked if there was some way we could make a connection. It's a long story, a lot of it happened in private, I will not disclose that. But Robin Williams' comment to a New York Times journalist who said, you know, cocaine is God's way of telling us we have too much money. And what Williams was really saying is, I've had it all. Why am I so empty? So my friends, here's what I want to say to you. If meaninglessness came only from pain, we've got a question with a very thorny side to it. But if it even comes from pleasure, then the question is much more full-orbed than just the issue of pain and suffering. Or as Alistair McGrath would say, we need an explanatory power to bring both of these components in answering. And the third question I say that in this component, the mix is this. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. In Georgia, there's a young gal by the name of Ashlyn Blocker. She's born with a rare disease called CPAP, congenital insensitivity to pain with anhydrosis. She doesn't even perspire through her pores and is insensitive to pain. I saw an interview with her on CNN, with her mother. And the mother said, you know, people think it's all wonderful. My daughter feels no pain. But when she's on the playing field, we have to watch her, examine her from head to toe after every game or every match is played to make sure she has not stepped on a nail, to make sure she's not made some contact with something that could cause a worse problem for her. If she puts her hand on a burn or something and doesn't even know that her hand is being burnt. And we struggle with this. And then she ended the interview by saying, my prayer every night is, dear God, please let my daughter begin to feel pain. Is there a possibility that in our human experience, what applies to the body also applies to the soul? That in that pain and in that suffering, we have to turn to a Savior. I put it in this, and I make one quotation of a song, and then I sit down. The supreme ethic is love. This is true in the Christian faith. Supreme ethic is love. Where there is love, there has to be the possibility of freedom. Where there is freedom, there will be the possibility of evil. Where there is evil, there is a need of a Savior. Where there is a Savior provided, there's the possibility of redemption. So if you start with the supreme ethic of love and go through freedom, go through the possibility of evil and sin, and the need of a Savior, and ultimately the possibility of redemption. The Moody Blues used to sing a song, why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door? With 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war. Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its creed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking on the door? The song ends by saying, I'm looking for someone to change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. How profound for the musician to recognize what needed change was on the inside, and for that, Jesus Christ, as the Savior of the world, provides the answer. He is our Redeemer. And I just say that while the question will always be debated and discussed, the truth of the matter is, I am convinced, outside of the gospel of Jesus Christ, there are no answers, where the captain of our salvation himself was made complete through suffering. And that side of it, Vince picked up to the gospel message. So that's what I want to share with you. Thank you for hearing me here.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your support of this book as well. Thank you to Rachel and to such a long list, everyone who made this event tonight possible. So grateful for all the work that's put in. Special thank you to my wife, Jo. It's her birthday today, so be extra nice to her when you see her. It seemed oddly fitting that this event should fall on her birthday, because this book really would not exist if not for her. Earlier today, I asked Jo if she liked the book, looking for a little affirmation. And she said yes, and I liked it the first 20 times as well. Which was no exaggeration. Jo poured over the chapters of this book. I think it's probably safe to say that there's not a page that I wrote in the book that does not look differently because of her care and her wise counsel throughout. So I'm so grateful. And I want to say thank you to Ravi as well. Ravi, it's been truly an honor to work on this project with you. I heard Ravi give an interview a few days ago, and the interviewer was sort of going over the different things that Ravi's ministry entails, and then he asked Ravi, do you enjoy it? And there was sort of a bit of a pause. And a few moments later, I think you responded, Ravi, by saying, there are many moments of deep enjoyment. But it really struck me that wasn't the most natural way to frame the question for him. I think for most of us, I include myself, if we have a choice about what to do in this life, when we think about it, the first question is, what will I enjoy most? And I don't think that's a question that ever occurred to Ravi. I think the question for him was always, what am I called to? What will honor God most? And what will help others most? And so it's been a great joy and a real privilege to work with someone that I not only enjoy and learn a great deal from, but someone who I deeply, deeply respect as well. I wrote this book for many reasons, my portion of it. One reason I wrote it is because I knew as a Christian, I personally needed to be better prepared to respond to this question of why suffering. In one of my first significant conversations on this topic after I became a Christian, that was 14 years ago, my Aunt Regina spoke with me about how difficult it was to see her son, my cousin Charles, struggle with a serious mental illness. And in response, I started spouting some of my more abstract, philosophical explanations for why God might allow suffering. And my Aunt Regina listened very patiently and graciously, and then she turned to me and she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." Okay, horrendous things happen in this world, and we only add to those horrors if our response to this question in any way trivializes the suffering that occurs, or most importantly, those who endure the suffering. Since that conversation with my aunt, I hope I have been much slower, much more inclined to listen and to pray for much longer before I thought I had some sense of what to say in response to this question or how to say it. So one of the things that this book is for me is it's my personal attempt at a redo of that conversation that I had with my aunt 14 years ago. There are many people who have suffered more than I have, and at times that's made me question, who am I to write things on this topic? But a second reason that I've written this book is to give voice to those in my life who have suffered most. If you ask anyone in my extended family, which two people's lives have had the most significant impact on our family, I have confidence everyone would say the same two names. They would say my cousin Charles, Aunt Regina's son, and they would say my Uncle John. Now, both Charles and John were seriously disabled in ways that meant they suffered more than the rest of my family. And yet their impact on our family has undoubtedly been the deepest and the longest lasting. During the years that I was wrestling with this topic, my dad was also struggling with the effects of type 1 diabetes. He's had about 24 surgeries as the doctors have fought to keep him alive and to keep his circulation strong enough to avoid amputations of his arms and his legs. And yet, it's been through seeking God in that suffering that quite clearly my dad has come to a place of strongest relationships in his life. Relationships with his children, with his wife, and for the first time in his life developing a relationship with God himself. My dad has no plans to write a book, and my cousin Charles and my Uncle John both died young. But this book is in part an attempt to give voice to them, to allow them to speak to others about their experiences, and to offer to others the comfort and the meaning that they found in their suffering. Each chapter of the book gives a different response to this question of why suffering, and part of the thesis of the book is that you don't need to choose between the responses. You don't need to pit them against each other. They're mutually reinforcing, and therefore there's strength in numbers. The overall response is stronger because there's more responses that we can appeal to. Each response, the way I like to think of it, is to think of each response as a witness to the goodness of God. What one witness says in a court of law, that one witness thinks that what he saw shows that the defendant is innocent, might not persuade a jury. But if 10 witnesses saw 10 different things that all seem to point to the innocence of the defendant, then that might be very persuasive. And that's the sort of cumulative approach that we've taken in this book, to say there's not just one response, but there's 10 or more responses. They each have something worthwhile to be said for them, and when we look at them as a whole, actually the response is much stronger than it is if we just look at one of the responses. Let me begin to open up just one of the responses that we've taken in the book. And let me start by telling one of my favorite stories. My parents were on their second date. They were standing on the Brooklyn Bridge. They were overlooking the picturesque New York City skyline, and my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. So he asked about the ring, and my mom said, "Oh, that's just some ring that one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice." And my dad said, "Oh yeah, it is nice. Let me see it." So my mom took off the ring and handed it to my dad. And my dad, he hurled it off the bridge. And he watched it sink to the bottom of the East River. "You're with me now," he said. You won't be needing that anymore. And my mom loved it. I think that was the clinching moment for them. Now, it was a pretty risky move my dad made, hurling my mom's ring off the Brooklyn Bridge. She loved it, but what if she hadn't? What if she had concluded that this guy's nuts, I better run back with the old boyfriend instead? What would that have meant for me? Now, I don't know who that old boyfriend was. In fact, if you can believe it, 50 years later, my dad still tries to get my mom to tell him who the old boyfriend was, and she still flatly refuses to say it. But I might be tempted to think that if my mom wound up with the other guy, I would have been better off. I might have been taller. I might have been better looking. Maybe the other guy was royalty. And that would have been great. I could have lived in a castle. But actually, that way of thinking is not quite right. There's a problem with wishing that things had worked out between my mom and the other guy. And the problem is this. I never would have existed. Maybe some other child would have existed, and maybe he would have been taller and better looking and lived in a castle. But I think that part of what makes me who I am, the individual that I am, is my beginning. The parents that I have, the sperm and egg that I came from, the combination of genes that's true of me. By wishing my mom had wound up with the other guy, I unwittingly wish myself right out of existence. And I think a similar confusion is sometimes at work when we consider the problem of suffering. It's typical to think of the problem of suffering like this. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. Then we picture ourselves in a very different world, a world with no suffering, or a world with very minimal suffering, and then we wonder, shouldn't God have created us in the other world, in the world without suffering, or in the world with far less suffering? And that's a reasonable thought. But I think it's a thought that relies on a philosophical mistake, because it relies on the assumption that it would still be you and me who would exist in that other world. And I think that is very controversial. It's something as trivial as the throwing of a ring into the East River can alter who comes to exist. Imagine how radically the history of procreation would be altered if we lived in a world that did not include the possibility of suffering. Imagine if the natural processes of our world were so different that they were never dangerous. Or imagine if human psychology was so different that we were incapable of feeling sorrow or grief or despair. What would be the results? I think that one of the results might be that none of us would have lived. Sometimes we understandably wish the world had been very different, but we may not be fully understanding what we wish for. One thing that we may be unwittingly wishing for is for us and our families and those we love most to never have existed. And I don't think that's a consequence that God approves of. Because I think part of God's choice of what world to create and to sustain was a choice of people. A choice for you and the person sitting next to you and every person that you see walking down the street. I believe God wanted to give life to each of them and to call them into relationship with Him for all eternity. Not because we are better or smarter or funnier or better looking than the other creatures God could have created. Not because we're more impressive. It's simply out of grace. Simply because despite all of our imperfections, God finds us lovable. He loves us with the love of a parent standing over a newborn child. Some people would say it would have been better if my cousin Charles never existed. It would have been better if my Uncle John never existed. There would have been less suffering overall. The world would be better off. I strongly disagree. And like my Aunt Regina, it's because I knew Charles's suffering intimately that it was so frustrating. But it's also because I knew Charles intimately that I can understand why God loves him so deeply and why God might value a world that allowed for him to come to exist. This approach that I'm sketching, it suggests a strong analogy between divine creation on the one hand and human procreation on the other hand. In human procreation, we risk a lot of suffering. We don't normally think of it that way, and rightfully so. We want to focus on the positive and the hopeful aspects of procreating. But intentionally having a child is a much more sobering decision than we sometimes give it credit for. We are doing something that we know full well will result in another person suffering seriously. Because even the most fortunate of human lives includes serious suffering. And even more than that, we know that one day, any child that we bring into this world will suffer death. Okay, I know that's a very difficult thought. Usually, it's very hard to justify doing something that we know full well will cause another person to suffer seriously. Why then do we think that having a child, human procreation, can be morally okay? And in fact, could be at times a courageous and a loving thing to do? I think one of the reasons is because the child who comes to exist would not have existed otherwise. In human procreation, we do risk great suffering. But in doing so, we bestow on someone not just any good, but the good of life. What I've been suggesting is that similarly, in creating and sustaining this world, rather than some very different world, God bestowed on each of us not just any good, but the good of life and the offer of eternal life. One of the saddest things about our world is that suffering can be so bad that sometimes people find themselves wishing that they had never existed. Personally, I find myself unable to even watch depictions of suicide on TV because I just find it so disturbing that someone would get to that point. Part of my Christian faith is a trust that what we currently see is literally only the first few moments of life. Okay, just the birthing process of human existence. And that one day, when we are able to see the whole story, no one who trusts in God will wish away their existence. This analogy with procreation, it suggests that the objection from suffering is more complicated than it first appears. If someone thinks it's wrong to create people in a world that includes the possibility of serious suffering, then they will not only need to call God evil, they will also need to call evil anyone who decides to have children. What follows, I think, is that if there can be good reason to think that human procreation could be an act of love, despite the suffering that comes with it, then there can also be good reason to think that God's creation of the world we live in could be an act of love. The loving parent is not the one who never allows suffering. The loving parent is the one who is willing to suffer alongside his children. Let me finish with my other favorite family story. I was about 6 years old. I was out playing American football on my next-door neighbor's front lawn. I was playing with a bunch of older kids. I was getting knocked around pretty good. I started crying. I came running home to my mom, who was standing on the front porch, and I was yelling, "I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough." And so guess what she did? Some of you will know the story. She did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do. She positioned herself in quite an athletic stance. She bent down and got into this sort of stance here. She hung her nose out in the air. She looked at me lovingly, and then she said, "Punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose." And I just looked at her like she was crazy. And indeed, she was. But she persisted. She said, "Punch me in the nose. Punch me in the nose. You are tough enough." And I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in, because finally I did. I reared back and I gave my mom this straight right hand to the nose. And to my astonishment and her astonishment, blood actually began pouring out of my mom's nose and down her face. Then came probably the most gorgeous image and the most vivid image of my entire childhood. Through this blood came the most dazzling, radiant, just joyful smile. And my mom said, "Now get back out there." She sent me back out into that game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. Maybe you don't know what to make of that story. What a bizarre thing for my mom to do. What an unthinkable, messy, bloody thing for her to do. But what an extravagant display of love. My mom chose to bring me into this world knowing that there would be suffering. And when the suffering came, when the tears filled my eyes, she bent down and stepped into my suffering with me, even though that meant suffering at my hands. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "The gods justified human life by living it themselves, the only satisfactory response to the problem of suffering ever invented." Nietzsche was writing of the ancient Greeks at this point, and remarkably doesn't make the connection to Christianity. But as a Christian, I'm very pleased to agree with him, and then to point to the cross of Jesus Christ, where God did something unthinkable and messy and bloody, where God bent down and stepped into our suffering, even though it meant suffering at the hands of his children. The ultimate response to suffering is not a response of an idea or an argument or a theory. It's a response of a person and of a parent, a divine parent who has ensured that there is no depth of agony or helplessness that we can experience that he doesn't understand, who has ensured that we are never alone in our suffering, and who has ensured that one day suffering can be no more. In the face of suffering, I know of no greater hope than this, and my prayer for this book would be that through reading it, some would come to know that person who provides that hope. Thank you for listening. That's what I wanted to share with you, and I think Ravi's going to come up and be happy to take any questions that people have. The approach that I was taking, that's a really good response to the approach that I was starting to open up. Because part of what I was saying was that, I'm not sure that we could be the individuals that we are if we were born into a world that was radically different. For example, a heavenly world. And you might think, well, that's problematic, because isn't it particularly a point of the Christian story that eventually we're going to live in a heavenly world? The key point there is what we are born into, our origins, where we are created. I think that my parents were the two who had to come together to produce me. But once I exist, my life can take many different avenues, and it would still all be me. So while I think that for me, as the individual as I am to come to exist, I had to come to exist in something like the world that we live in, I think God can make the avenue of my life very varied. And I trust and hope that that avenue will head towards a place where there will be no more mourning or death or crying or pain, and that will still be me. Another response that I should give credit to Richard Swinburne for, who's in the room somewhere, and see him afterwards if you want him to give you the response more clearly. But it may be the case that there are a variety of good things that God values. And while some of those good things and the highest of those good things exist in heaven, it may be that there are some good things that he values that exist in something like the state of affairs that we currently live in. It may be the case that you're able to exercise courage in the face of true danger in a way that you're not able to exercise in a heavenly state. That you're able to sympathize and empathize with others who are going through suffering in a way that you're not able to do if people are not going through suffering. If there's a variety of types of good things that God values, and if he values all of them, then perhaps it's not surprising that he would have us live in one sort of world for a period of time, and then in a much better world for a longer period of time. And if it's also true that it pains him to see us in suffering, then maybe it's not surprising that he would make the portion of our existence where we are getting the goods that are allowed by suffering to be the much shorter portion, and the heavenly portion of our existence to be the much longer portion. A couple thoughts.
It's a great question, and if I may bring two anecdotes to bear upon that. I think that down payment of that kind of futuristic promise is actually even presently evident in the midst of suffering. There's a book written by Roland Bingham. It's called Something Beautiful for God. I think Muggeridge may have leapfrogged off that, writing on Teresa when he called it The Making the Beautiful. But the story by Bingham is about a woman called Annie Johnston Flint. She was orphaned very young, and shortly after that, adopted by another family. She was actually born Annie Johnston, and then was adopted by the Flint family. Early in life, contracted rheumatoid arthritis, went on to spend decades in bed, was incontinent most of those years. Beyond that, cancerous and blind. She became one of the greatest hymn writers of the church. And one of the hymns she wrote, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. Bingham says the last time he saw her, there were 8 pillows cushioning her body because she was covered from head to toe with sores with the decades in bed. How is it that the down payment of that which is going to come in the future becomes so energizing even in the present, that life becomes an example of how God can take you through all of that now to the greatest consummate moment when we are with him? So let me switch. My father-in-law was an engineer with Shell Oil. He was a hard-nosed empiricist, always wanting evidence for everything. A committed Christian, but very always asking for evidence and evidence and evidence. When he contracted cancer 4 months from diagnosis to death, he struggled a great deal. And he would sit down with me and, just raise the question. But as the truth began to just get deeper and deeper, he was a great lover of the hymns. And he always asked his wife, Jean, my mother-in-law, to play some of the great hymns. He went into silence for about 3 or 4 days, and then spoke his last words. He looked up to the heavens and said, this is amazing, simply amazing. And then he looked at his wife of 63 years and said, Jean, I love you. And he was gone. When I look at a life like that, you can look at a young couple in their early 20s pledging themselves to each other, and it's a beautiful thing to see. But when I see a man in his mid-80s looking at his wife of 63 years and saying, I love you. It is an incredible demonstration of what was pledged 6 decades before. And the consummate moment was indescribable for his children to behold. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, and the clouds be rolled back as a scroll. The Lord shall descend, the trump shall resound, even so it is well with my soul. My proposition to you is this. Just as a professor here would look at a student who's endured much, gone through much, and at the end of that hand the degree and say, well done. I think we stand before God with that affirmation and that demonstration. When faith becomes sight, we are taken into the presence of living God, when the only response will be one of worship and one of gratitude. I believe there are hints of it now when we know him, and the moment of final meeting face to face is like the one who's run well and loved and kept the promise that he made. It is a confirmation of a decision you already made, and through that process, that confirmation is a demonstration of your interplay between faith and reason to get the divine accolade. Well done. I think that's where you move to that final stage. Yeah. And I think he responds to that in John 9, when the people come to Jesus and ask him of the question, Fascinating that they asked him, is this man born blind because of his sin or because of the sin of his parents? And Jesus says, neither. It's because of neither. And he goes on ultimately to heal the man. He said, but this is done so that the work of God might be displayed. What is the work of God? From creation, through this veil of tears, as someone might say, up to the end when he raises us up from the dead. Why Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb, his grave, is absolutely remarkable. I find it fascinating that he who knew that he was about to raise him still shed those tears. And I think it is because he knew what we would have to live through, what we would have to go through, that he wept our tears, that we would have to endure all of that. And if indeed one of the sites of Lazarus' grave is there in Larnaca, Michael and I were there together, whether it's a legitimate spot or not, I don't know. But he went on to become the Bishop of Larnaca, and the grave marker in Larnaca says, Lazarus, Bishop of Larnaca, twice dead, friend of Jesus. He did have to die again, and the sisters did have to weep again, or whoever stood around him. I think the healing miracles were to attest that he was indeed who he was, but he also knew in the end he could not wipe away every tear in this world. And I would just look at the Apostle Paul as an example. It is fascinating what he prayed, because chronologically he came differently to Christ than the other disciples. They came understanding his birth, life, death, and resurrection. Saul of Tarsus to Paul comes from the resurrection, and he says that I may know him, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. He took that journey backwards towards the cross of Christ, that he would know him. I don't think the ideas are antithetical to each other. I think they are complementary, that God does perform miracles. He does perform healing. I've lived with a broken back since 1985. And unbelievable the nights and days I spent with a triple fusion, till the pain was so agonized, just couldn't put up with it. And yet, I would just have to say, about 2 years ago, something remarkable happened. When a friend of mine, I won't go into that story, and all I can say is from that day till now, never taken anything for pain. He prayed with me, and it's an incredible pronouncement that he made that I've experienced that, and I've tested it. Is this forever till I meet him? I don't know, but have these 2 years been remarkable to be free from that pain? It's been wonderful. I think we go through both, my brother, and I think the miracle of God is ultimately the change on the inside, which is exactly what he told the Pharisees, The real blindness is what you face, not the blindness that he did. And if you would experience the miracle of God's grace of new birth, you would see it all very differently, I think.
Just add very briefly, I think sometimes we can foreknow that there will be suffering and make a choice, and we know as a consequence of that choice suffering will occur, and yet still deeply regret the suffering. And I know, Michael, key to your views on this is that God regrets some of the way that the world has gone, and that we can actually hold that God created at some point an order that was good, and that there was a fall from that order, and that is something that God, in a meaningful sense, would regret. And I would want to say that it is possible to hold on to a notion of regret within a framework in which God foreknows that something will occur and makes a choice that he knows as a consequence of choice that will eventually occur. And I think the analogy with parents and child is really helpful for me here, in that the fact that parents know having a child will result in serious suffering does not mean that that's their desire, or that they have caused it, or that they don't deeply regret it. And so I would want to frame the approach that I was opening up in that sort of context, which would make it compatible with the sort of free will approach that you would take. I think of God as having created the world, having created human persons in a state in which they were good, in a state in which they were in an intimate fellowship with him. And there is a depiction of that in the beginning of the Bible, as many of us know. I think there's a lot of truth in that depiction that even the person who's not committed to Christianity can see. We're told a story of people who are tempted, and then they begin to doubt whether or not God is really for them, whether or not God is right. Then they sin, there's disobedience. Then they immediately feel shame. Then they hide themselves from God. Then they start accusing each other. There's judgmentalism. She did it, the snake did it, he did it. That story really resounds with truth to me about where suffering comes from temptation to doubt, to disobedience, to shame, to hiding, to judgmentalism and accusation, and then ultimately to suffering. So I want to frame everything that I've said within that sort of story and say there's still a question, though, after human persons have fallen. Well, why does God allow this world to continue? Why does he continue to sustain a world? Because it's not just a question of how the world was created in the first place, but this is the way the world is now, and God allows it to continue to exist. So even if we have that whole framework in place, there's still another question about why does God allow it to exist in this way? What could his purposes be to redeem suffering, even if, going back to the last question, he regretted it in the first place?
My responsibility in the book was on the moral side of the argument, the conflict between different religions and worldviews and how they each deal with it. Always remember that this issue is so vast and so common to human experience that every worldview needs to answer it. Sometimes we end up with the feeling that as if just the Christians are on the block here, nobody else has to do any explaining of this. The entire corpus of Buddhist material from Gautama Buddha was born because of suffering that he witnessed. The whole issue, and Buddha's answer ultimately, in a simplistic way though, but the simple statement was, you've got to stop desiring. It's desire that causes all of evil and suffering. It's fascinating that when I was interviewing a Buddhist monk in Bangkok, she's a PhD from McMaster University in Hamilton, Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, and became the first ordained monk in Buddhism in Thailand, and the Thais don't ordain women, female monks, so she went to Sri Lanka, got ordained, and came back. I had about an hour and a half with her. And while we were talking, I said to her, if desirelessness is the ultimate goal to which you are aspire, can you explain to me why the Dalai Lama wants the liberation of Tibet? That he desires it. She paused and she said to me, shall we just say because he chooses to? I said, so what you're telling me is he's choosing to be less desirous of the ultimate goal than this particular choice that he's making. She said, we do not ask such questions. She began to move on. So, what is the question? The question assumes selfishness would be wrong. And my challenge with that issue growing up in the East is, why is it wrong? Why is it wrong? I think the only way we can say that is if there is an absolute moral law by which we must measure ourselves. If selfishness is not wrong, then the question disintegrates. If selfishness is wrong, my thought is you have to bring God into the paradigm. That's where the absolutes really come from. So the reality of the question actually invokes the need for an absolute moral lawgiver. That's the first. The second one is this question actually has different shades. When I was growing up in India and had so little, actually had nothing. My dad was powerful, but he didn't have any money to spare. I never recall having a single rupee in my pocket that was given to me by my parents for pocket money. I didn't. I just found a way to make friends with people who did have it, and that's how I survived. And you know what I always thought to myself? If only I could get to America or Canada or get to the West, if only I could get there, I'd be happier. I'd have whatever I wanted. I'd get all I needed. I'd have my car. I'd have my home, everything. So we left our tiny little home in Delhi, and my father sent my brother and me over. After a few years, I said to myself, am I really happier with what I now claim as my own? Or was there a sense of dependence and need that was very legitimate and very right on my part in the early days? See, the Trilama says God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, evil exists. These three cannot coexist as ideas. That's the Trilama. We forget the fourth, the Quadrilama. God is all-wise. And I just say to you, when you trust in Him and walk in lockstep with Him, you find out His wisdom